everyone. As Daisy just said, my name is Siobhan Huggins, in case you're not sure how to pronounce that. And some of you may actually know me from cholesterolcode.com, where I work with Dave. If you've ever seen the articles with the little expand button to hide the citations, those are mine. But far before any of that happened, I actually had my own encounters with cholesterol. For example, when I was 9 years old, my dad had a heart attack. He luckily survived, but I was left with a bit of a sense of betrayal from this idea that your body could try and kill you with something called cholesterol. Now, the sense of betrayal would only get worse when 10 years later, when I was 19, I went into my doctor's office to review my latest blood work. My doctor immediately started berating me because not only was I very overweight at 240 pounds, but I also had high blood pressure. Worst yet, in his eyes, was my cholesterol. It was actually so bad he wouldn't even give me an exact number, only that it was over 300 and the worst he'd ever seen in someone my age. Now, I said that I wanted to address these concerns with diet and exercise, but he replied that I could eat grass and drink water and my cholesterol wouldn't change. This is rather ironic, considering who I work with now, but regardless. In his eyes, at least, there's only one thing for me to do, and that was to go on a statin, and I actually walked out of the office with a sample pack of Crestor. Now, I never ended up taking the statin, but just recently I did get my hands on the blood work from that time, and it did take a little bit of effort, and I was actually hung up on multiple times in the process, but here it is. Now, if I had seen these numbers back then, I likely would have agreed with my doctor, because at the time, I really only saw markers as just numbers on a page, where anything in bold or out of range was bad, and anything that wasn't was probably fine. But some things have changed since then. For one, I'm now 100 pounds lighter, and I no longer have high blood pressure. And yeah, for another, since that time, I've done a lot of studying, and Dave can actually confirm this. And so as a result, I no longer see markers as just random numbers. Instead, I see each one as a different character that all work together to help shape a story that's taking place in every single one of us. Although I do still have high cholesterol. So as you'll soon be able to tell, I don't tend to focus so much on the energy distribution side of things like Dave does. Instead, I tend to focus on what happens after VLDL has dropped off its triglycerides, and we're left with the LDL we all know and love to fear. And you will be forgiven if this is the first thing that comes to mind when I say that, because after all, high LDL is associated with cardiovascular disease, and it's even called the bad cholesterol. You don't really need any more information than that. You can all leave. No. Okay, so what I'll actually be focusing on is best summed up by these images, and that is LDL and in fact the entire lipid system's role in that support system, so defense and repair. But I'll actually be improving on a slide that Dave did because he actually left out a character, lipoprotein a. It has been coming up a little bit more in the keto community, so I'll be bringing that up a bit later. So many of you likely already know the signs of the support system at work. These include things like low HDL and high triglycerides and pattern B LDL and all that bad stuff. And these are often paired with other non-lipid related markers, including high CRP, which is an inflammatory marker, hyperinsulinemia, which I'm sure you'll hear a lot about today, and many others I won't go into. But one thing I learned very quickly is that all of these are a response to something else, namely damage or injury or illness in the body. And after I began to study them more, I began to see them as protective mechanisms, not just bad markers. I saw them as a way we can defend against something, and when that something resolves, although unfortunately sometimes that when is an if these days, some of them also help us to heal. Now, because my focus was on cardiovascular disease at the start, I tended to focus on these guys because those were the ones that were brought up the most in regards to atherosclerosis risk. And all of these actually have something in common. All of them are or relate to lipoproteins. Here's an example of a lipoprotein here. In this case, it's LDL. So all lipoproteins have a couple different things in common. For example, they all have a phospholipid shell, which keeps the cargo nice and safe. They all have identifying proteins, in this case ApoB, which helps other cells recognize what it is so it can do the job it needs to do. They also carry triglycerides, which are used for energy, as Dave has said. And they also have cholesterol, which is probably what they're most known for. Now, because I worked so closely with Dave, I did know at the beginning that after VLDL drops off its cargo, it is often remodeled into LDL. And in fact, this is one of the ways that we can get LDL onto the field. And the other thing that I learned soon after is that the production of these VLDL particles is based on the availability of its cargo, the triglycerides in the liver, not cholesterol. Triglycerides are the driver. So I found it quite interesting that during the first response to injury or infection, one of the things that can happen is an increase in triglycerides. And this results in higher VLDL and hypertriglyceridemia. In other words, just high triglycerides. It's just a fancy word for it. So this left me with a couple questions. For one, how do we actually do this? And for two, why even bother? Now, in response to the first question, I quickly found out that there's something called proinflammatory cytokines. It's a sciencey sounding term, but it just means a signaling protein. And these are used like a dispatch call put out by cells to put out the alert that something is going on. This something could be, for example, a pathogen was spotted in the area, or it could also be a physical injury like a broken arm that needs to be repaired. Regardless of what that something is, they're there to put out the news to be on alert and to call for backup if it's needed. Now, they actually found that if they directly inject people, essentially, with one of these signaling proteins, in this case, tumor necrosis factor alpha, this in itself will induce higher levels of triglycerides. And after looking into the mechanisms behind it, I found that what they're doing is essentially this. They go over to the fat cells and they say, go ahead and release your fatty acids. And those make their way to the liver, and at the same time, they're telling the liver, increase your production of fat through something called de novo lipogenesis. Now, the increase of triglyceride in the liver, both from the fat tissue and from the liver making more of it, results in higher VLDL production. And this may sound similar to pathological insulin resistance, which you may have heard of before. That's what this is. Now, the question after this is why? Why do we want to make more LDL as a downstream effect? And this can actually be found in a hint as to how long these guys are staying around. Because VLDL and IDL, they're pretty much gone through rapidly, but LDL sticks around for several days at a time, and even longer during infection. So what LDL is doing during this time is it's patrolling. It's on duty at this point. And what LDL can do is it can bind to pathogens. And during this process, what happens is the LDL particle becomes damaged. And once it becomes damaged, immune cells can then see it, and they'll clear it out of the system with pathogen in tow. And after that's done, the pathogen is killed, and things are a little bit safer as a result. This is the guy that kills the pathogen, kind of a judge, jury, and executioner kind of thing. So what LDL is doing in this case, to really emphasize the point, is it's essentially taking shady characters to the station to be dealt with, and as a result, they're making the streets that much safer for everybody else. It's worth noting that all lipoproteins are involved in this binding process of pathogens, but the one that's most abundant in the system and the one that's most easily upregulated in the case of emergency is LDL. So, a bit of a team leader. So the way that the macrophages I mentioned before kill the pathogen is through something called a reactive oxygen species, or a free radical. You might have heard this mentioned in terms of aging and all that type of stuff. They're actually used quite heavily in the system, especially by immune cells. And the reactive oxygen species kills the pathogen by way of something called oxidation. And oxidation can also lead to something called chain reaction oxidation, which is essentially where something is damaged and then it continues, that damage spreads through the cell and sometimes to other cells, so it's not great. So in order to protect from collateral damage, what LDL will actually do is it carries antioxidants. So the fat-soluble vitamins it carries, A, D, E, and K, E, for example, can be used as an antioxidant to essentially disarm these guys, to protect our cells. And if that isn't enough to get the job done, LDL will actually do something very brave. It will sacrifice itself. It'll allow the fats in its shell to become damaged, and once a reactive oxygen species oxidizes something, it's done. It can't do anything else. But like I said before, this damage can spread, so LDL will actually do something to prevent that. It'll just get rid of the broken pieces, so it can't be harmed by them anymore. And after it's done this, something interesting happens. The phospholipid shell will essentially scrunch up to protect the cargo, and as a result, we have smaller LDL with a small amount of phospholipid content comparative to healthy LDL. So these are two components of small dense LDL that you hear about all the time. Essentially, they're damaged LDL. And they're a sign that the immune system has been using LDL to protect against something. And that something could be pathogens, like I said, but it could also be poor diet, sleep deprivation, any number of things. But LDL's job isn't done yet, because like I said before, it's made up of phospholipid and it carries cholesterol, and these two things just so happen to be the same thing that all of our other cells are made of, all several trillion of them. So in this way, LDL is essentially the perfect repair kit if a cell is damaged and needs to be repaired. So it is true that cells can make their own cholesterol, but they can also request extra cholesterol if they need it. And they do exactly that when they're severely injured. And how this works is that same immune cell I mentioned before will go over to a damaged cell, recognize that it's damaged, and say, express LDL receptors. And the cell does so. And through something called receptor-mediated endocytosis, which just means to eat something whole using receptors, it'll eat that LDL particle. And once it's done that, it can break that apart and use really whatever it needs. Now this is useful not just in the case of infection or anything like that, but also during exercise. As Dave has demonstrated in his own data where he ran a marathon and then got blood drawn a little bit after, his LDL particles went down, likely because his muscle was using those LDL particles to repair themselves after the damage caused by exercise. Okay, so that kind of sums up LDL's job. It's not everything, but it's a fairly good overview. And after I learned all this, I was kind of confused because LDL is often talked about as a waste product. It's talked about like it's garbage, like it has no use. But in fact, when after looking into it, I found many uses, many protective uses, many healing uses for LDL. And the thing is that we upregulate it when we're hurt. And this may be one of the reasons why LDL gets such a bad rap. Because when things are going bad, it's higher. And the assumption is that LDL is causing the damage. For example, in the case of heart disease. But it may actually be the other way around. It may be protecting from damage. And that's why it's associated, because we make more of it. Now, I saw this same reaction being had to lipoprotein a. Essentially, it's a dangerous thing. It causes damage. It's like LDL but spiked. I've seen that said before. And lipoprotein a is another lipoprotein, hence the name. And even just by looking at them, you can tell it's quite similar to LDL. They're almost like cousins in a way. But lipoprotein a doesn't originate from VLDL. It's kind of its own thing. And it also has another one of those identifying proteins, the apo-A. That's the long tail there. And lipoprotein a is talked about very poorly because it's associated, when it's high, it's associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And this could really be for a couple of reasons. For one, it's speculated to be an acute phase reactant. Just like the triglycerides going up when things are bad, so does lipoprotein a. And I saw this in my own data. I'm a bit of a obsessive person like Dave. And so what I did is when I got sick, you can see this blue line is the CRP. That's an inflammatory marker. That high point up there, that's a CRP of 48. Over 3 is considered bad. But just a couple weeks later, it went back down to normal. And this orange This orange is lipoprotein(a). So you can see, unfortunately I didn't get a first data point for it, but you can see it going down after I get better and going back up as I get sick again, and back and forth and back and forth. So the question from this is, what do we use it for? What is it actually doing during this time? So one of the things is, remember how I said that after LDL is oxidized, it'll take off those broken parts and get rid of them. And this is actually where lipoprotein(a) comes in. Because lipoprotein(a) can essentially mop up those broken pieces. Because remember what I said earlier, these can spread damage to other cells, even after they're removed. So what lipoprotein(a) does is it catches it with its tail, and then once it's done that, it can break them down and pass on those now harmless byproducts to another protein found in the blood, so they can be put in the trash. So essentially, what lipoprotein(a) is doing here is it's acting like a janitor. It's sweeping up broken glass so other people don't step on it and get hurt. And this is talked about in this paper where it says that lipoprotein(a) may actually be beneficial by acting as a transporter and scavenger of oxidized phospholipid. But again, these are multi-purpose things, and so it has another job. It helps with the integrity of clots. So a clot has to remain flexible enough so it doesn't break off and cause issues, but it also has to remain stable enough to act like a bandage in an area and help with healing. And lipoprotein(a) helps manage that balancing act along with a couple other things. And spoiler alert, this is actually internal injuries as well. So they did a test looking at a couple different types of injured tissue, including arteries, and they found that about 90 to 95% of the lipoproteins found in that wounded tissue, including in the arteries, was lipoprotein(a), not LDL. So here's a conundrum. This means that every other study talking about LDL found in the arteries could actually be seeing lipoprotein(a) in the process of helping wounded tissue, and they may not even know it. Because if you take the tail away, if you're not looking for it, it's very easy to confuse these two. Now, while studying the immune system and lipoproteins, I found plenty of them that I just discussed that go higher when things are bad, but I also found one that goes lower. And you probably know this one as the good cholesterol, and HDL is called that exactly because when things are going well, it's a little bit higher than usual. So I found that regardless of whether you're looking at the energy side of things or the immune system side of things, HDL is acting as a manager. So it'll provide things like enzymes, proteins, even the lipids it carries to immune cells and other lipoproteins to help them do their job properly. So when it's off the street, it's busy. So when it's lower, something is going on. Here's one example. So normally in a healthy condition, HDL carries an enzyme that prevents LDL from being oxidized. But when you become sick or injured, that enzyme is found in lower amounts. And they speculate in the literature that essentially this is a way to get cholesterol to immune cells because they'll eat the oxidized LDL. But another way to think about it is this is HDL telling LDL, you are now on duty as a part of the immune system. Look out for things that can hurt other things, and be prepared to sacrifice yourself if you need to take care of it. Another thing is that when we're sick or injured again, HDL will help increase inflammation. And this part actually didn't make much sense to me at first because I kind of saw inflammation like this, where anything that increased inflammation was bad, because inflammation is like a burning fire. It's a bunch of matches that damages anything it comes into contact with. So anything that increased it, like the changes found in HDL, was not good. And after all, cardiovascular disease is called an inflammatory condition, and even depression is associated with inflammation in the brain. So in that case, it would make sense. We got to put out that fire, so let's do it directly with something like anti-inflammatories. But I started studying it more in depth as I do, and I didn't see it that way anymore. I started to see it like this. Because inflammation is part of how we heal, and it's how we protect ourselves from damage. So if you sprain your wrist, for example, it'll become inflamed in order to repair that damage. Or if you get sick, you may get a fever and become inflamed in order to fight against the bacteria or virus or whatever is causing damage. So by targeting inflammation directly with anti-inflammatories, for example, we're sort of doing this. I don't want to make inflammation sad. He's helping me. So I found this exact concept reflected in a drug study that was used to directly target inflammation. It actually targeted one of the signaling proteins I was talking about before. And it was said that it was going to be better than statins, and this was being used to help prevent heart disease. So it was supposed to be better than statins. It was going to be great, but the actual results weren't fantastic. So first of all, for the people on the placebo, the sugar pills essentially, compared to the people taking the highest dosage, it went down less than 1%, the rate of heart events, so not that great. Although in an article it actually said this was better than the results of statins, which is technically true. The other thing is there was no significant difference in death from all causes, and what was actually jumping that up was death from infections. Whoops. So this reversal of thinking that I just applied to inflammation can actually be applied to the rest of the support lipid system as well. For example, we often hear things like this, that HDL, higher HDL, helps create a cardioprotective environment, so it's helping to keep the heart safe. But there's an issue with that, because if we find a genetic cause for higher HDL, it's actually not associated with lower risk. But we can actually reverse this thinking and understand why this might be the case. For example, if we start to think an environment that's cardioprotective generally results in higher HDL. So if you're healthy, your HDL is a little bit higher, then it makes sense why a genetic mutation, in this case it's called SCARBY, and it prevents the clearance of HDL properly, why that wouldn't really lower risk, because it's not reflecting a healthy environment, it's just a genetic fluke. So it doesn't really tell us much in isolation. And here's another thing. So HDL is acting as a manager. And part of how it does that is its structure and its function. So there are drugs called CETP inhibitors, and what they do is they mess with a protein that helps HDL do that managerial job, and it interferes with that. And this does successfully raise HDL, but it also interferes with its structure and function, as speculated here, that might be the case. And this may explain why death from all causes, when we look at CETP inhibitor studies, all-cause mortality is higher than the control group. And this may be because HDL can't do its job. And so we die more from infections again. Now, let's go ahead and do another reversal. In this case, small dense LDL is dangerous and directly damages the arteries. I've heard this pretty much since I started low carb. You know, LDL isn't bad, it's the small dense LDL that's the devil here. But reverse it. An environment that damages arteries may also increase small dense LDL. And if you remember, oxidation is one of the things that can lead to small dense LDL. So it may not be that these guys are directly damaging the arteries. It could just be that having a lot of them around could be an indication that you're trying to fight damage from somewhere, where if that's not properly controlled, then that could lead to damage of the arteries and increased risk of heart disease. So here's another one, getting tests while sick. And the blue line is CRP again, and that orange line is small LDL. You can see how it kind of follows along. So that could be an indication that I'm actually using my LDL to help protect against the oxidative damage that I'm using to deal with whatever I was sick with during these times. So here's another one that Dave has quoted from a study in one of his presentations, where they said that essentially remnant lipoproteins are particularly atherogenic and high levels increase risk of heart disease. But remember that remnant lipoproteins include VLDL, so we can actually say this. An environment which leads to cardiovascular disease increases levels of remnant lipoproteins as a part of the immune response to protect from damage. Because way back at the beginning, remember that I said that triglyceride levels go up in response to injury. And those triglycerides are carried in VLDL particles. So if we're constantly putting those out, in order to get LDL as a downstream effect, then we would have higher levels of VLDL. So this may explain why, they're associated with bad things. So this is why I have issues with taking markers in isolation. Because let's take this case. How much can you actually tell about someone's health from their weight alone? You don't know their gender, you don't know their height, you don't know their body fat percentage, their waist circumference, nothing, just their weight. The issue is they could be 5'1" and 50% fat mass. Or they could be a foot taller and mostly muscle. Same weight. You can have this exact issue with taking markers in isolation on your own lab work. So, for example, I have come across multiple times, in at least a dozen cases now, where people had really high triglycerides in isolation. Everything else looked fantastic, but they were freaking out because their triglycerides were super high. Well, their HDL was also high, their insulin was low, their inflammatory markers were low, and it turned out that it was coffee. They had a caffeine or coffee sensitivity or something like that, and once they cut out the coffee, then they were fine. Yes, Brenda, this applies to you too. So essentially is the conclusion that everything is a proxy for something else and reacting to something else, and so none of it matters. I've actually seen this before. After people see Dave's stuff, they're like, oh, LDL doesn't matter, so I'll just not pay attention to the lipid panel. If you take anything away from this, do not let it be that, please. So instead, what I'm trying to get across is that in order to understand what's actually going on, all of these markers are working together to do something. And so you have to take them in context. And what I mean by that is take all of them together and see what sort of picture it's telling you. And then try to understand how they work together. Next up is that these are dynamic. They're reactive. That's their whole job, is to react to things such as energy or the immune system or whatever. So understand that if things are looking bad now, that's not always going to be the case. We heard stories from Richard and Carl and Brenda and everyone, and things were looking really bad for them, but once they addressed the underlying cause of the problem, things are fantastic now. The other thing is that because these are dynamic, there's going to be some normal fluctuation even in the space of a week. So try and understand what that normal fluctuation looks like so you don't get freaked out. For example, triglycerides tend to be really, really noisy. So if it's under 101 test and then a week later it's like 110, don't worry about it. You're fine, probably. No guarantees. But the other thing is there are some markers that are worth looking for a sudden change, like HDL. HDL tends to remain fairly stable. It'll have slow shifts and, react to diet and things like that. But if there's a sudden drop, I would want to know why, because this can be related to some concerning health issues. So understand things like that, and it can really help interpret what's going on. Next up is understand how your recent behavior may impact the lab test. For example, when Dave ran the marathon, his numbers were different because his body was reacting to the environment. So this includes caffeine, coffee, including lots and lots of coffee. I keep seeing this. Exercise before the test. If you exercise recently, then, inflammatory markers may be higher because you're healing muscle and building new muscle. Carbs, carb leaks, things like that. Are there any sugary sauces that may have interfered? Anything you may have had recently, a birthday dinner or whatever, that may have caused your triglycerides to go super high? Keep in mind and log your food before a test. And also alcohol, even keto-friendly alcohol. If you're drinking lots of alcohol, just be aware it can impact results. And knowing all of these things can help you troubleshoot if there's an issue. And also try and target the root cause of something. So back to that weight measure, let's say that the person was in fact 5'1" and not very lean, and they decided to target what they first noticed, which was their high weight. So they come back and say that they lost 15 pounds. And you ask them how they did it, and they said that they were standing on the scale, and they took one foot off and put it on the floor, and the number on the scale went down. Now, I'm sure that is true. They're not lying. But the question that I come back to in that case is, was a lower number on the scale what they were actually going for during that time? Or were they using that number as a proxy for better health, losing fat, dealing with insulin resistance and stuff like that? Now, this same practice can be applied to your lab results because there are supplements and things you can take to lower LDL, raise HDL, lower inflammatory markers. But again, are taking those things actually getting you closer to your goal? If your goal is to get a lower number in isolation and everything else remains subpar, fine, good. But if your goal is better health, try and do things that target everything all at once and improve them, because that's a likely sign that you're actually dealing with the underlying issue. And lastly, don't panic. Because like I said before, if things are looking bad now, these things aren't set in stone. If you address the underlying cause, things will improve. And as it happens, you are actually in a room, and I guarantee there's at least one who has been in your exact position right now if you're worried that things are not looking great. And I guarantee that they would love to help you if you just ask for help. This is a community, and everyone wants everyone else to be healthy. So don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to do your own research. Try and read up and understand how these things work, and talk to your doctor as well, and maybe teach him something. All right, thank you.